There is a cliche that there are events, particularly disasters, that stick out so strongly that you always remember where you were when that happened. Some examples of this would be, I guess, the end of World War II, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, JFK being assassinated, and Augusto Pinochet losing his re-election referendum. But yeah, that's the cliche, that these things stick out so strongly in your mind, you remember where you were. So when 9/11 happened, I guess I was 10 years old at the time, and I was in grade 6. And I remember the teacher announced that the World Trade Center had been hit, and my frame of reference at that age was largely Command and Conquer. So I remembered in Tiberian Dawn, in the intro, the Brotherhood of Dawn had blown up the Vienna grain trade building, so I thought that that was the World Trade Center. And with regards to who I thought did it, I had been playing Red Alert 2 at the time, so I thought Russia was behind it, because it was similar to a couple missions on Red Alert 2. And I guess that shows where I was at that point in my life, intellectually. But the fact remains is I can very vividly recall that day. I can recall going home, watching the footage, thinking this looks like a movie, this is surreal, this is madness, all that kind of stuff. And now 2 decades later, I think it's time to look back. And as someone who was there and someone who watched the aftermath of it, is the narrative correct? What actually happened? What happened afterwards? So I'm going to start off by saying 9/11 was the biggest media circus of all time. I don't think there's ever probably going to be another one. There's events in life that are tragic, like Columbine, any number of like rape cases or sex abuse or all this kind of stuff, which is sad and tragic. But the media just goes so far and they make it into such a just over-the-top circus. It goes past that and it just becomes hilarious. And 9/11 is a good example of this. And someone who didn't grow up during this era, I don't think really gets it. Pretty much overnight, this term post-9/11 came into fruition and everything was like post-9/11. CSI was now post-9/11. Star Trek was post-9/11. They randomly would start like inserting torture and terrorism plots into basically everything. I guess like something that was actually post 9/11 was something like 24. But generally speaking, it just became a meme. Like rerunning the same 9/11 footage over and over again for months, for years. It just kept happening. It just became such a like media circus that I think within a couple years of it, I stopped taking it seriously. I remember by the time I was in university 8 years later, I just thought it was really funny. Just like I said, because of how just insane it was. And it was just this weird, like, the people who died on 9/11, I'm not saying it's not tragic, but I feel like it's kind of blown out of proportion, because it was like, what, 3,000 people? And I'm sure like a similar number of people die a year from like falling down the stairs. Probably in a lot of like states that many people die from traffic accidents. There's all kinds of other stuff, but it's like, and I've been listening to the news, and it's kind of hard to not just smirk a bit at some of it. So like a generation grew up without parents, and like 3,000 people grew up without parents. I mean, I think a similar number of Americans died in the Iraq War, but I don't really hear people say they grew up without parents. It's just this like weird thing, and there almost immediately was this cult of the martyrs of 9/11 and the cult of the first responders. And I'm not trying to like demean them. I mean, it's brave to go into a situation like that, and I get how traumatic it was. But every time something would happen for the next decade, the remainder of the Bush 2 terms, it would just be 9/11 first responders. The 9/11 first responders want us to invade Iraq. We have to avenge 9/11. All this other stuff has to happen. And it just got mentioned so much. It was just this massive cliche. And I remember even during the Obama era, so the narrative switched from it being a tragedy to it being this inspiring event. Where the day after 9/11, and Glenn Beck came up with this really cringe thing called the 9/12 Project. He's like, because after 9/11, the day after, everyone was united. The whole country was united. There was no more civil discord, Republican, Democrat, all this partisanship. There was no partisanship at this point in time. I don't know if the narrative changes whether there was partisanship during the 90s or not, or if it was something that just started like after the aftermath of 9/11. And as someone who was like there, that wasn't the case at all. It's bullshit. Like it's a complete fabrication that's what happened. Maybe for like 2 days people were united in their grief, or in the case of Israel, their joy. But like people, there was immediately the camp that blamed America for 9/11 and said it was the fault of their foreign policy. There was immediately the people who said this is Clinton's fault, this is Bush's fault. I remember like a couple days afterwards, there was like some sort of documentary that tried to blame Clinton for not killing Osama bin Laden when he got a chance. Does anyone remember Fahrenheit 9/11? Does anyone remember the Iraq War? Does anyone remember the Afghanistan War? Does anyone remember the Madrid train bombing or any of these other things that happened in the aftermath of 9/11 that were super, super divisive? Does anyone remember the Patriot Act, where America basically said, look, guys, we got hit with this one terrorist attack. We're going to turn ourselves into this G-slurred police state, and we're never going to repeal it, and we're just going to spy on everybody permanently. That's how you deal with this problem. You don't limit immigration from the countries that produce these terrorists. You just spy on everybody. And that's how you resolve these problems. And that was kind of like the narrative was, it was this period of unity. Sure, there was like civil strife. Sure, there was all these protests. Sure, there was multiple wars that wound up going nowhere, but it was unified, guys. Bush was the greatest president of all time for like 5 days. And this narrative just continues, and it's just really insufferable. And I think I always hate these narratives that like people were united in the past and there wasn't these issues, because in a lot of cases it's kind of demeaning the people who cared about things that mattered, at least to them, and saying that these things were irrelevant or trying to minimize them or stuff like that. There's also this whole it's the end of innocence narrative, which is once again just really, really Giesler. It's like, oh no, nothing tragic had ever happened in American history before. There was no Civil War, there was no World Wars, there was no 1960s, there was no crack epidemic. 9/11 was the first traumatic thing to happen in American history. Sure, they haven't had another attack nearly that scale, but the trauma remains, guys. It's the worstest thing that's ever happened. And once again, maybe this sounds really cold, but I went through like over a decade of this being referenced on every news report. It's kind of like with Columbine, as I said. Columbine was a tragedy. I'm not trying to say it wasn't a tragedy. But the media circus was just so over the top, and everything was compared to Columbine. And you couldn't even say the term, and stuff like that. And it was just so just retarded. And that was kind of the aftermath of 9/11. And I guess I thought at the time, I was very pro-war in Afghanistan for an extended period of time. I actually thought that this was kind of a good thing in the sense that it showed us who our enemy was and who we could kind of take down. There's also kind of, this is maybe the last period where it was kind of okay to like hate on a minority. So I know people like were really anti-Muslim for a long period of time, and you were allowed to criticize them. But I think that was the last time you were ever able to criticize a minority. You just can't nowadays. And that kind of brings us to the Iraq War. And no one, to this day, I still have no idea what the Iraq War was about. No one has any idea what the Iraq War was about. It was just complete and utter madness. People will say, like, Bush lied. I mean, this is kind of like really basic bitch stuff, but I remember at the time Bush was like, yeah, Saddam Hussein did 9/11. He totally was involved with it, guys. We need to invade Iraq because of 9/11. And then later on, he's like, yeah, it's Saddam had nothing to do with 9/11. That whole thing was bullshit. And then I know for like the next decade, neocons were still like, we need to stay in Iraq because of reasons. Because look, guys, we overthrew the Ba'ath Party. We made it into a breeding ground for terrorists. We have to stay there now. It's the Pottery Barn rule. You got to fix what you broke. And that was kind of like the aftermath. And now that brings us to kind of the other thing that 9/11 did was I feel like it really made a lot of conspiracy theories more mainstream than they were before. I mean, this is kind of the ongoing thing. Was 9/11 an inside job? Was the US government behind it? Was there even airplanes? Were they missiles? Were they holograms? Were they dragons? Were they wyverns? Like, these are ongoing issues. And it led to an endless number of people analyzing low resolution, crappy photos you couldn't tell anything from and saying this kind of looks like that instead of an aircraft. Or jet fuel. Okay, well, I mean, we know jet fuel can't melt steel, but dank memes can melt steel beams. So, no, jet fuel can't melt steel. What about Building 7? What about all this other stuff that happened? And it just became like decades of just fairly mainstream conspiracy theories. And I've kind of gone back and forth on this a little bit. I don't know if I've ever really thought 9/11 was an inside job. And there's one very good reason for it, and I think that was really enforced lately. The US government is retarded. Like, the CIA is retarded. None of these people know what the hell they're doing. So, how could they carry out something like 9/11 and keep it secret? Somebody would have leaked it from now. That, like, they wouldn't have been able to coordinate any of this. Like, I just, that's to me the smoking gun, as it were. Like, none of the people involved are competent enough to do something like this, let alone keep it secret for a prolonged period of time. Like, let's not talk even about the morality of the people involved or any of that stuff. It's just these people are stupid. So there's that. I think what's more likely is that there were people who knew about it, who had gotten intelligence reports or something like that, and they might have overlooked them because they could use the crisis to invade Iraq and to do some other stuff and pass the Patriot Act. To me, that's plausible. That's possible. I think ultimately, though, they probably did know about it. They were just retarded, and they just couldn't like do anything about it because the U.S. government just sucks that much. And the question is, people are like, "Oh, could Muslims have really done this? Could Al Qaeda have really done this?" And I mean, the operation seems pretty straightforward to me. You hijack an airplane and crash it into a building. I mean, it's not like rocket science. I guess it's maybe aeronautics. But from my understanding, flying a plane isn't really that hard. It's taking off and landing that's the big deal. Is it really that difficult to believe that a well-funded, well-organized terrorist group got a series of guys with basic flight training and told them, look, guys, on this day, hijack these planes and fly them into these buildings? Like, nothing about that really seems overly complicated or difficult to do. I mean, obviously, it's like, I don't know if I could do it, but it's nothing like insane. It's not like there's like radiation guns or like some 20 year long chess plan. It's just like A plus B equals C. So I tend to believe that regardless of whether the US government was involved or knew about it or was just retarded and couldn't do anything about it, I don't think 9/11 was an inside job. I think Islamic terrorists did it. I think to a certain extent, maybe it's kind of an Occam's razor thing, like which is more plausible. Maybe not even that. Is there a reason to go beyond the idea that Islamic terrorists did it? Is there anything impossible about that? Is there anything implausible about that? is there anything unlikely about that? And the answer is no, because they do coordinated terrorist attacks all the time. Like the Paris nightclub shootings, some of the train bombings, the Boston bombings. They consistently do that. Many of these people are even smaller cells. They aren't like the centralized Al Qaeda leadership that carried out 9/11. So, is there like any reason to kind of go beyond that? I mean, once again, when we get to school shootings, people talk about MK Ultra and people talk about the government doing them, and maybe in some cases that happened. But to me, it's generally speaking more likely that you just have fucked up kids with access to guns who go on a murderous rampage. Like, mental illness is a thing. There's a lot of disaffected, mentally ill kids who aren't getting proper help, or who do get help and the help just screws them up more. And they have easy access to guns, and then they just go shoot people up, like schools up. That, like, I don't really know why beyond that you need to kind of go into the whole conspiracy thing with crisis actors and stuff like that. Maybe like the furthest I'd be willing to go is maybe they like egged on these kids. They like they got a report from their teacher or something. It's like, yeah, these kids are fucked, and then they deliberately egged them on a bit or something like that. That's as far as, generally speaking, I'd be willing to go. But maybe it's kind of like this naive idea that the average person isn't as capable of evil as you might think, and that that is this shadowy cabal. I just kind of press X to doubt how united and how competent these people are to be able to do this stuff. Also, I feel like if 9/11 had been an inside job, we'd have more definitive proof by this point in time. And people will say there is definitive proof, but there's just so much nonsense surrounding it. It's kind of like another historical event, which I can't mention because this is YouTube, where I don't know if you can really know the exact truth. Okay, maybe something I can reference. I can't reference that one event because it's illegal to talk about, but like the residential school thing, we have no way of knowing what actually happened because it's so politicized. There's so much nonsense. People just make stuff up. It's impossible to know. Kind of like with another historical event, which I think did happen, but if you question any of the details, like if you question was there really skin lamps, then you can't ask that question. You can't say maybe it wasn't quite 6 whatever, maybe it was only 5, or maybe it was like, maybe if you say the number 5,999,999, you can't say that. You can't even ask that question. So it's just something that's so heavily politicized on kind of both sides. I mean, there's the mainstream narrative, but then there's also like the opposite direction where it just gets so kind of crazy that it's you can't really take it seriously. That I don't know if the truth will ever be known, or if it is fully known, it'll be decades from now. So those are my thoughts on 9/11, the conspiracy theories, what happened. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it interesting. God bless, and I'll talk to you guys real soon.